Firing Line with William F. Buckley, Jr. Tonight, a war on poverty. Hope or hopeless?
Well, Michael Harrington, the young and engaging man from whom you're about to hear, and by whom I am about to be whiplashed, is commonly acknowledged as the man who first declared the war on poverty, the only war he has ever declared, I hasten to add, since as regards orthodox wars he is a conscientious objector. His most famous book, called The Other America, described a portion of the American population beset by tormenting poverty. That book caught the attention of Professor Walter Heller, who brought it to the attention of President Kennedy on the 19th of November, 1963. That book was a tocsin call for massive federal action to uproot American poverty, and President Kennedy tendered his approval for such a program, and 3 days later died. But when Dr. Heller took the subject up with Mr. Kennedy's successor, Mr. Johnson reacted with enthusiasm, and so the war was born, towards the prosecution of which we are spending about $2 billion a year. Not nearly enough to satisfy Mr. Harrington, I'm sure he will make clear, with that emotional conciseness for which he is greatly and justifiably famous. Mr. Harrington was, by the way, raised in St. Louis, went to college at Holy Cross and Yale, and took an advanced degree at the University of Chicago, greatly impressing students and faculty alike by his brilliance. Sometime after leaving college, he joined the staff of the Catholic Worker, having first taken, or so the story goes, a pledge of personal poverty. A mutual friend sometime later remarked to me that the foundations of the country are going broke, maintaining Michael Harrington in poverty. But no matter, he has hardly impoverished the social or polemical literature of America, and I welcome him to a discussion of the poverty program and to some of the general problems it raises. We'll be back in a moment with Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington, there seems to be all kinds of definitions floating around about what poverty actually consists in, and you're supposed to be some kind of an authority on that subject. How do you define poverty for purposes of the poverty program?
Well, it's not how I define it, it's how the government does.
I'm more interested in your definition.
Okay, mine's the government's, because it's become very precise.
The government usually does what you tell it, is that what you mean?
Oh, not at all, not at all. It hasn't done 1/10 of what I would like it to do. But after the president originally declared war on poverty, and after my book, which was fairly vague as to the precise character of poverty, a lot more work was done. And now we have a very good definition, I think. It says that the upper limit of poverty, the well-off poor, are a family in which the 4 people living in a city, in which the woman is presumed to be a good cook and shopper and can spend 22 cents per person per meal, or put another way, can spend for the big meal of the day for all 4 members of the family 95 cents. That's the top. That meal, by the way, is a basic nutritional meal figured out by the Department of Agriculture. And the government's thesis, which I subscribe to, is that if you have an income under that necessary for this meal, you will be choosing between necessities. You will have to have less than enough food in order to have decent housing or clothing or medicine.
If you're making the point that people have to eat, I will concede it, in order to live. But what disturbs me is that there are a number of professional students of the problem who raise questions and points that in your copious literature on the subject you simply haven't disposed of very easily. By that $3,000 figure, for instance, that you rely on so heavily, over 50% of the United States was poor in 1929, and yet that is historically known as one of the exuberant years in American history. Isn't that correct? Don't you really go further and say that poverty is defined by the relative scarcity of funds in the society in which you live? The people whom you call poor in the United States would be considered rich in India or Latin America, would they not?
Well, first of all, let me clarify a fact, which is I don't use a 3,000 criterion, and neither does the government. We use a criterion of $3,130 for an urban family of 4.
Well, there must have been inflation since I read
No,
this.
it's not an inflation, it's that we have made much more precise and answered the objections, which were in some cases validly raised, that we did not specify for family size, for people living in the country, etc. Secondly, there is a sense in which the poverty definition is relative, historically relative. To tell a poor person without enough food in Appalachia that he's better off than an Indian peasant is cold comfort to him, because he doesn't live in India, he lives in Appalachia.
Well, that's what I'm trying to reach for. In other words, to a considerable extent, the subjective feelings of the person you're addressing are relevant.
No, sure, of course they're relevant.
Yeah.
But,
well, don't say quite of course, because some people think they are not relevant.
No, but if you'll notice...
Unless we describe poverty as something a little bit different.
The definition that I gave was one not predicated on the subjective feelings of that Appalachian poor person, but predicated on the amount of nutritional material necessary, given our standards, for a most minimal diet, assuming, which is not always the case, that they will use money in the most precise and exact way to feed themselves. Hunger, lack of nutrition, loss of lifespan, disease, these things are not relative. These things, a person who is hungry in Appalachia is as hungry or has the same experience as a person in India.
Well, but I thought a moment ago that you leaned rather heavily on an escape clause. You said that people are poor who, if they had to reroute some of the money that would be spent on their nutrition to other, quotes, necessities, would be people who would fall under your program. Now, going over the statistics, one sees that, for instance, 15% of the people who are officially classed as poor under this definition bought new cars year before last. Now, would you say a new car is a necessity under this psychic definition or under the more objective definition?
First of all, most of this new car kind of old wives' tale that is tossed against the statistics.
Why am I talking about an old wives' tale? I'm talking
because all of those definitions that you're quoting and all of these objections were urged against the first definition, not the one that I'm using. That is to say, one has to study the literature and know what the government now says, not what it said 2 years ago. Secondly, it does happen to be the case that in rural areas of the country, for a poor farm worker or farmer, a car is indeed an absolute necessity because he doesn't have a bus or subway.
I was talking about a new
but
car,
more
not a
basically,
car,
I think the real
Mr.
argument
Harrington.
between us, the real argument between us is that in the 19th century, the conservative said to the tuberculosis-ridden, immiserated British worker, think of how better off you are than a medieval knight. And the real issue is not how better off than an Indian peasant an American poor person is, but how better off he could be if we lived up to our social responsibility.
Well, but don't you think some people believe that the problem is not one as regards what would ideally obtain? Ideally, not only would there not be any poverty here, there would be no poverty anywhere else in the world. And to that end, we have from time to time committed ourselves and are at this moment engaged, for instance, in sending $1 billion worth of grain to India. So I think that the people who criticize the poverty program do so to some extent with reference to the resources of the society. And then, of course, it gets terribly confusing because, although you've been very well disciplined in your definition of poverty, in fact, a lot of the literature on the poverty problem describes not only material poverty, but a poverty of a completely different order. Paul Jacobs, whom you know and admire, has written that the poor in America are not so much physical as psychological paupers. And the economist Henry Wallach has said poverty seems to be primarily a social condition. They're talking about loneliness, alienation, and all of those problems.
They're talking about, let me not speak for Paul Jacobs or Wallach, let me speak for myself. I do not talk simply of some non-quantifiable thing called loneliness. I talk about the fact that the rate of psychosis and neurosis that is observed by the public authorities among poor people is 2, 3, 4, and 5 times greater than among anyone else. And that far from the American myth that those who suffer on estates in Connecticut have the terrible pangs and the torments of affluence, while the noble savages in the slums, far from that myth. In fact, the estate owners have much less neurotic and psychotic lives than the poor people. That being kicked around and being pushed down and living in dense, miserable housing and dealing with cockroaches and rats are not the kinds of things that make one a balanced, content, normal and adjusted, healthy personality.
Yes, and I couldn't agree with you more, but I'm trying to raise the following problem, namely, to what extent is a poverty program that is materially designed to dissipate such difficulties as you have elaborated, to what extent can we count on it to alleviate all of these concomitant miseries? Paul Jacobs, for instance, says that one of the things about poor people is that they don't receive letters, they don't receive mail, and I think that he says so very poignantly, i.e. that this is one of the great afflictions, especially in a modern and hectic society, that when people are no longer useful, somehow they very often get dropped. But do you really think that the government, through a highly bureaucratized poverty government, can reach in and help a person of that kind? Or aren't you really, really stuck because what is at fault with this society is that an ethos of a kind that did make even very poor people happier than relatively rich people are today, made it possible for them to come to grips with their existence?
Well,
you, after all, do despise our social order. You don't believe there's such a thing as religion, and under the circumstances, you are, in your active polemical life, doing very much that, in my judgment, has the effect of depriving people of some of the consolations and some of the truths that might make them more serene.
Well, could I have there's so much that's been tossed at me, if I could have a second. First of all, put aside for a moment whether the federal poverty program is highly bureaucratized, as you characterize it, because I think that's a shibboleth. But leave that aside for the moment. To get to the basic point, can a materially oriented public program affect the inner psychological torment of the poor? And the answer, I think, is to a certain degree, yes, to a certain degree, no. For example, in 1955, during the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King and the leadership of the boycott did not make a single speech to the Negroes in Montgomery about stop criminal behavior. But because the life of the Negro in Montgomery took on a dignity and meaning and purpose, without anybody mentioning crime, there was a decline of about 20% in the amount of crime among Negroes of Montgomery. Similarly, this year, the government has given us some figures that would indicate that if we would put more income into the slums, the incidence of broken families would drop, because one of the big reasons that families break up is because there's not enough money, because a man can't be an economic father, because many of our welfare programs literally penalize marriage by refusing any kind of welfare as long as there's an able-bodied, although unemployed or poor male in the house. So I'm saying yes, by material federal action, we can change some of these circumstances and improve some of the psychological and spiritual life of the poor.
I have no doubt you're correct, and we'll get back to that. I have a cue over here that we're supposed to pause for a moment. Mr. Harrington, the reason I mentioned your own political faiths is because necessarily I think that they are relevant insofar as you are a leader of the poverty program. You are primarily interested, of course, in changing the social order. You have a great and eloquent contempt for capitalism, even, I gather, for those achievements of capitalism which made it possible to accumulate a surplus which can go to the poor. Now, you are, in some people's eyes, primarily interested in the poverty program, not because they doubt the integrity of your own interest in the poor, but because you find it a means by which to advance a social revolution. You, after all, dedicated your last book to one Trotskyite, one socialist, and one left Democrat. And you've always been very unambiguous about this. This is hardly one of your secrets. Now, those of us who believe that the poverty program is in some way related to the success of the free enterprise system, on the one hand, need to oppose you as you profiteer on the poverty program for your own ideological ends. And on the other hand, we need to try to be apparently more convincing than we have been to make you study the figures which show that only 23% of the American people reach the poverty level, only 23% of the people are today making less money than 63% of the people in 1929. That is to say, our own system has given us over a period of 30 years the greatest net rise in public income in the history of economics. Now, at what point do you feel that your devotion to revolution, peaceful revolution to be sure, in this country, is really dominating your thought? At what point are you willing to concede that your interest in poverty is in effect a vested interest, and that if the free enterprise system dissipated poverty completely, you would still you would be left rather embarrassed without some sort of a medium to advance your revolutionary zeal?
Well, briefly, the answer is at no point. Let me clarify it simply. First of all, I'm not a leader of the federal government's poverty program. I was not offered a job, but I specifically did not take a job because, although I appreciate the beginning effort and I'm for it, I want to be out calling for more and not saying that what we've done is enough. I don't believe it is. So I'm not a leader. Secondly, let me say unambiguously that there is nothing socialist or revolutionary about the present poverty program. The nature of the American enterprise system and its ownership is left totally intact. General Motors has not been touched. As a matter of fact, one of my criticisms of the poverty program is that the Herald Tribune about a year ago said blue chip corporations looking at poverty program, and there are big corporations which are diversifying by getting into the job training business. I don't like that sort of thing, but the present program is a liberal, ameliorative reform program. I'm delighted to debate socialism at some point, but the poverty program is not socialism.
Well,
one last point, because maybe clear up all of the things that you put on the table, and that is contempt for capitalism. I don't like capitalism. I think it's much less than, well, I think it's a mythological system in that we talk of free enterprise, but we have gigantic concentrated corporations. But I agree that it is exactly the magnificent accomplishments of American enterprise and capitalism and business and the kind of dog-eat-dog misery that we went through that now makes it possible for us to be decent. And I think that when we finally do get a modicum of justice in the society, we should revere those dog-eat-doggers who did make it possible.
Well, perhaps contempt was too strong a word to describe your feelings on capitalism. I was struck by that sense of yours which goes, practically every ethical, moral, and cultural justification for the capitalist system has now been destroyed by capitalism, which some people would find contemptuous at least.
Well, no, this is something I think you would agree with me on.
Let me, well...
No, I think you would agree, because what I was saying is that the old free enterprise, or the old market economy that you revere and want us to go back to, the old free enterpriser, the man who saved up string and made a big business, whom you look back to as a great man, that man is going. We're having the organization man.
Well, I've been hearing that for 25 years. Meanwhile,
well,
we have 75 million jobs, which we were told was impossible back when we had a mature economy with 42 million jobs. And so I have a certain amount of faith in capitalism and suggest that it's likely even to survive your own strictures against it. But I am very much interested in your saying that there is nothing at all socialistic. To use the word in the way that you're using it is highly old-fashioned. Nobody anymore thinks of socialism as involving purely the ownership of the means of production. Obviously, it's a socialistic program. Socialistic in the sense that it is financed and governed and directed by a central authority, that it does not encourage private means by which much of the same thing can be done. The federal government, and this is typical of the socialist bias, would much rather administer its own poverty program than, for instance, give deductions to individual businesses or individual entrepreneurs who will take on the job of training somebody. They'd much rather keep somebody poor and take taxes from him, if only to give it back to that person after a whole series of tedious passages through the bureaucracy. It strikes me as extraordinary that the same government that says anybody who makes less than $3,000 is poor taxes somebody who makes $3,000 $258 a year. So these, I think, are some of the paradoxes which do suggest that there is a highly socialist bias in our present approach to the problem.
First of all, I'm delighted to make a united front with you to advocate that all people classified as poor should be exempt from all taxes. I totally agree. Secondly, as I hope you do know from the Economic Opportunity Act, the government does have programs precisely providing loans for business if those businesses will hire people who are poor. Thirdly, as I just mentioned, private industry is in the poverty program. It has been farmed out to corporations like Litton Industries, for example, as a piece of it. Various other businesses are in the poverty business. Finally, as a matter of fact, my objection to the poverty program, or one of my criticisms of it, supporting it as a start, is that it is overemphasized local initiatives, that it has strewn the legislation with veto powers, that it is utterly localized, and that the conservatives and generally the Republicans in Congress hampered and paralyzed the program in part by refusing to give the authority for some real comprehensive planning to Sergeant Schreiber.
You know, it suffers to the extent that it is not sufficiently socialized in conception and administration, so far as you're concerned, and I see your point of view. But for those of us who believe that history shows that the most successful assault on poverty has precisely been conducted in this country, there are those who are concerned at the increasing centralization of all of these functions in the hands of the government, and who also wonder whether or not some of you liberals oughtn't to concern yourselves a little bit more with the aridity of the society that you are constructing. Because, let's face it, and let's now talk not macrocosmically, but in terms of actual people, there are people who are not poor at all. There are people in the University of California who lead miserable lives. There are people who tolerate dirt and who tolerate rats because they haven't got the energy to do something about it and don't care. Now, something contributed to the utter deracination of those people. Something was responsible for their not developing an ethos. And I suggest that it is unfortunately the case that the materialist orientation of the poverty program is one that insufficiently takes these matters into account. And you may very well find, after you have run out of any complaints about the nutritional dereliction of any members of the American society, that you will have walked into an unhappier society than ever existed before.
Well, I'm sort of surprised the degree to which you're becoming a big government man. Let me quote a...
When did that happen?
Well, you want me to concern myself with things, intimate alienation, psychological aspects. I don't have that idea of the range of government. I'm more for limited government. That is...
No, I wasn't suggesting this was the government's role at all.
I believe that we can, in this society, we have the resources and the political and social techniques to do away with meals which are not nutritional enough, to do away with miserable housing, so forth. That I know we can do. That we can make man happy, I'm not about to guarantee at all. I think man has to make himself happy, although I think there are some things that we can begin to do now. For example, I think that in a society that is obviously getting more and more leisure, we can provide socially and economically the resources, the parks, the playgrounds, the theaters, the painting materials, the teachers, so that people can choose a productive and creative leisure.
Excuse me, we have a cue. I'm sorry. Well, Mr. Harrington, I think that just about everybody does agree that the problem of poverty is one that ought to be explicitly faced. The arguments have to do with whether or not a colossus that comes out of Washington, D.C., with an indistinct understanding of what are the principal ailments of the community, is the way to go about it. Now, you say that you, although you don't particularly welcome the participation in the poverty program by private enterprises, nevertheless, there is a certain amount of that going on. Not nearly as much, I'm afraid, as you would suggest, as witness that no tax deductions, for instance, are allowed to businesses that currently take on the job of training people who are previously unskilled. But the point I'm trying to make, I gather, ineffectively, is that one of the causes of poverty is despair, and that one of the causes of despair is a general social condition which we know as the great malaise of the middle part of the 20th century, and that ironically, paradoxically, although we have more and more goods, and those goods are more and more widely distributed, and the, quotes, poor in this country are minuscule by contrast with the poor of any other nation in the world. Even so, people are unhappier in greater numbers than they were before. And it's not only the poor, as I said before, it's the intellectuals at the University of California, it's the rich, and it is others. Now, I am saying to you, is it possible that your particular pursuit of the poverty program precisely misses the main point? The main point being that we've got to rediscover the ethos for these people, and that under the circumstances, what they need to do is to be wedded more organically to their community, reunited with the old ideals, given back something of the old spiritual energy which made life worthwhile. Don't you suppose that there are an awful lot of people under the poverty program who really laugh at your concern for them as really missing the point? There is a considerable literature of bitterness, precisely on the part of these poverty people to those who think that they are really helping them by the kind of doses that you have been prescribing.
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I don't think there's a federal colossus in the poverty program. As President Kennedy pointed out in his speech on economics at your alma mater, Yale, in 1962, I believe it was, actually, the federal government, in terms of the American population, has hardly been growing at all, whereas the enormous increase, 30, 40, 50, 60%, has been precisely at the grassroots, at the local level. I would point out, as a matter of fact, that the federal poverty program is almost all geared to that local level and to local administration. Secondly, I would question the implication of the fact that a program is in Washington, that this makes it somehow bureaucratic or anti-freedom. Because in point of fact, as we have discovered in the last 2 years, poor people in the United States tend to regard their bureaucratic enemy as the mayor right down at City Hall near them. And insofar as their freedom of choice has been somewhat modestly expanded in the Community Action Program, it's been by Washington coming in not as a bureaucracy taking freedom, but as an institution which is giving some leverage against the local bureaucracy.
Cut it out. That's largely has to do with a sheer, utter, total economic ignorance. If the average poor person in this country had any idea of how much money was coming out of his pocket to finance that great friend in Washington, there'd be a mutiny. Look, in point of fact, you happen to believe in the metaphysic of big government. You have written, when the people own the state, through political democracy, then public corporations are truly theirs, and nationalization is an instrument of freedom.
Of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority is an excellent, publicly, democratically owned corporation.
Well, it's straight out of
which the people are not revolting against.
Well, as a matter of fact, I think that if you look back on some of the exultant predictions of the socialists in the 20s and so on, who became the bores of the 40s and the 50s, you will find out that what you've just said now has been said now by all the people who are interested in the dogmatical ejaculations of socialism.
No,
in point of fact, Washington is, or can be, of course, a servant of any man, provided it is put to that person's use.
No,
but mostly what goes on is the kind of thing that I finished describing a moment ago, namely that simultaneously you tax John Jones so much that he comes down to the poverty level, then you rush forward with transfusions of cash to him, and you get this kind of circumlocutory nonsense which bureaucrats thrive on, and which you only get around to objecting to when you're actually faced with it. You say, sure, I'm all in favor of relieving those taxation. Why haven't you come out for that publicly?
Well, this is all very metaphysical and facetious and interesting, but I'd like to talk about some facts. That in places like the Tennessee Valley...
Wait a minute, I didn't invite you here simply because you're for poverty. I invited you here because you're a very interesting person.
Of course, and I'm now saying that in terms
you've written very widely on a number of subjects.
In terms of public corporations, which you quoted from The Accidental Century, Macmillan, in terms of public... yes, indeed, save me from poverty. In terms of public corporations, we have an excellent example of a public corporation in the United States, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which has manifestly benefited the people, which every politician and every citizen almost in the area is for. Now, beyond that,
Of course it manifestly helps me if I take money from you and acquire it for myself. There's no reason, justification in the world for the Tennessee Valley Authority to have had lavish transfusions of cash if those transfusions had the effect of making people in Nebraska poorer.
the only problem with your economics is that it's simply inaccurate. That is to say, the American economy is a national economy. An increase of buying power and well-being in the Tennessee Valley increases the ability of the Tennessee Valley to buy products from New York and Nebraska. We need, in some cases, to take states like Mississippi, ruled by conservatives, and send some money in to raise their level up so that they can decently participate in the American economy and get over their Goldwater abstractions there.
Mr. Harrington, I know that your concern is greatly over other people's abstractions. And my whole point is that everybody's entitled to his abstractions. The difference between us being that you like to co-opt the federal government to beat me over the head on account of my abstractions, whereas I'm prepared to let you alone. Now, the Tennessee Valley Authority obviously is going to create cash. I defy even you to dump $3 billion in any 40 square miles of the United States and not create something. My only argument with the mentality of the TVA is that there is, of course, no continuing justification in its continuing to produce power when it has a whole series of immunities from federal taxation, when the effect of that is obviously to tax people out over the country for the special privileges enjoyed by a few.
Well, the problem is that the thing that TVA does with its power is it sells it more cheaply than private companies, and secondly,
Sure.
although it's immune,
Obviously, because it's not taxed.
It's immune from the onerous job of double bookkeeping, because all of the profits of the TVA go to the federal government. It has no profit that goes
Why
to
didn't
stockholders.
anybody think of that before? It's a marvelous idea. We could
I
eliminate
agree it's a
bookkeeping
marvelous
completely
idea.
by simply having everything that goes to us go immediately to the federal government. And then from time to time we can press our modest claims on
I
it.
think to perhaps become less of a debater and to try to really put a point on the table, I don't have an ideological predilection for the federal government and the poverty program. I believe that in the cities, the middle class in the post-war period has moved out, taking their taxes and leaving their problems. I believe that the major cities of America do not have the resources, therefore, the tax base, to deal with the poverty problems and the slum problems. I believe that the states, through the historic nomination of conservatives before reapportionment, defaulted. And it's not because I have some great predilection for sending everything to Washington, but because Washington is the only place where the resources and the directing intelligence to deal with problems that in a great many of instances are national economic problems.
No, the trouble, Mr. Harrington, is that you tend to complicate the problem by adopting a series of positions that increase rigidities which otherwise would shake loose by the operation of the free enterprise system. The answer is that more people wouldn't come into the large cities if it weren't that they are lured into the large cities by sometimes highly profligate policies and sometimes by indirect subsidies of big business. If in fact General Electric, let's say, in the middle of Chicago, wants to hire a janitor at $50 a week, that janitor is simply not going to be available unless he himself in his other capacities receives a whole series of free services, schools, hospitals, and the rest of it. So there could even be an indirect subsidy to General Electric by the government in systems like this. But the free enterprise system says, for heaven's sakes, let the deployment of people be a function of the free market operation, because that way, in the last analysis, you will be adjusting the society more to the desires of the individuals. Otherwise, you're going to have some sort of a program after the next program after the next program, on the basis of which you're going to be ending up carting people around to wherever it becomes convenient for that intelligence of yours that lives in Washington that you spoke about a moment ago, or to have them.
See, I think several things, three quick things. Number one, if the conservatively ruled states in the South would stop exporting their miseries, would stop simply displacing people into this great free market, that would alleviate some of the problem. If we could get some money into Mississippi, I want to help Mississippi.
What do you mean exporting them?
I mean to say
suppose
that,
they would
for
say you
example,
were importing
in
them.
Watts, a great deal of the problem were poor Southern Negroes who were in Southern states ruled by conservatives, driven off the land,
What do you mean?
had no way to earn their bread, came north not because they were lured by profligate welfare policies, but because they could not eat in Mississippi. And that if
Mr.
we
Harrington,
could have a Mississippi authority with some of my federal money.
There is still another America for you to write a book about. And I'll nominate one in which you go down to the South and you will find out there isn't massive starvation in the South. People would be very, very surprised to find out that they go hungry in the South. This would come as quite a revelation to them. No, they go to Los Angeles for any number of reasons, some that you and I would approve of, some that we might disapprove of. But it is also true that they are being lured to certain places in large part by ideologists who want them there because they make for votes or because they make for cheap labor or for whatever reason.
Could I intrude?
If you can do it in 5 seconds.
I can't.
Excuse me. We'll be back in just a moment.
We are now prepared to accept questions from the members of our studio audience for our two debate participants. When your name is called, would you kindly just stand and read your question directed to either Mr. Buckley or Mr. Harrington? I'd like to suggest, too, that while the questions are directed to one participant, perhaps the other might have some interesting comment to pass along afterwards. Mr. Bert Esco, please.
Political scientist. Mr. Harrington, given the proposition that participation of the poor in making decisions array poverty programs is desirable, even essential, how can the necessary machinery for such participation, deliberation, debate, voting, etc., be set up in the beginning of the program in view of the general and understandable apathy of the chronically poor, especially regarding political matters?
Well, I think one should not expect a gigantic upsurge from poor people. They have been so beaten down, so disappointed, that they're going to be wary. I think, as a matter of fact, far from being chagrined by the 5%, 4% participation that's been achieved in places like Philadelphia and other cities, I'm happy. That's a beginning. The mere fact that you have an election, you have a convention, is the important thing. Finally, here I think is where the real problem is for the federal government, which in this sense I think is expanding freedom for individuals at the grassroots, not to let the city halls and the political leaders get total control. I think that's why it's a Buckleyite point that I will make here, that it's so important for the federal government to guarantee the grassroots participation, and that indeed it is Washington, not City Hall, which at this point represents that grassroots participation.
Mr. Buckley, do you have a comment? Well, we have a question directed to you, Mr. Buckley. Miss M. Livingston, please.
Do you not think that poverty programs are corrupting because they stifle initiative and free enterprise?
I think they can be. I think there's no question about it that although it's very unfashionable to talk about it, some people are lazy. There is no question but that to make laziness profitable is corrupting. Now, I will grant that there are the larger difficulties, and that under the circumstances of the larger difficulties, you sometimes have to neglect the latter difficulties. But I do very definitely agree that the old-fashioned vices still exist, and that some of them are encouraged by indiscriminate welfarism.
I believe Mr. Harrington has something in the nature of a
Just
rebuttal.
one comment, not a complete rebuttal. I would only like to point out that about half of the poor people in the government's statistics work full-time, and about the other half are mostly people who can't, because of age or disability, work, and that therefore the problem of laziness is really a minor problem.
We have a question now from Mary R. McCarthy.
I'm a retired teacher. This is addressed to Mr. Harrington. Do you believe that the anti-poverty funds really provide conditions that will help the poor to become self-sufficient rather than developing a dependence on government aid?
Given the fact that I have criticisms of the program, I think I'd like to emphasize that the approach being taken is precisely to this independence and self-dependency. The program is oriented towards making people able to take jobs. That's about half of it. The other half is community action, where poor people themselves are invited to participate and encouraged to participate, at least in theory. So that I would say, and I know from my own connection with people in the program in Washington, that its emphasis is almost inordinately on self-dependence and making people able to function, rather, and precisely in breaking welfare dependency.
Mr. Buckley, you have anything to add or detract?
No, only that I wouldn't have expected a different answer. I don't think anybody who's going to talk about the poverty program says no. On the contrary, we want to keep people lazy. Don't you understand? That's very important. The obvious question is it working? We don't know whether it's working. It'll take 2 or 3 years before, as Mr. Theodore White has said, we discover whether or not poverty programs have developed their own ethos. I very much fear that we will have discovered that they don't, which is one of the reasons why I think that we should be more inventive and look for other means by which to stimulate the drive against poverty.
We have a question now from Mr. Irv Feld, directed to Mr. Buckley.
Buckley,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
self-employed. Now, do you, Mr. Buckley, really think that this poverty program is being propagandized for the Democratic Party's political advantages or disadvantages?
Sure. There's no question about it. Practically every political program is a program on which there's going to be a lot of political profiteering. Mr. Richard Nixon came out a few days ago and endorsed the recommendation by Senator Murphy to put the people who work in the federal poverty program under the provisions of the Hatch Act, i.e., to make it illegal for them to make politics on federal time, is what it amounts to. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
Would you care to comment, Mr. Harrington?
A quick one, which is the Democratic Party has gotten some deserved credit for taking the leadership in this fight. However, it's, I think, a little more complicated than Mr. Buckley indicates, in that Democratic mayors have often been most vociferous in attacking the Community Action Program. And in a sense, the Democratic leadership has financed some programs which is upsetting local Democrats in big cities throughout the United States.
Mr. Harrington, I believe this next question is directed to you. It's from Mr. Stanley Klopotsky.
Stan Klopotsky, I'm a teacher, and part of my question was answered by your previous statement. But can you elaborate on the statement that you made about conservatively controlled states and cities before, when the biggest states, or the biggest cities in the United States have been, for the past 20 or 30 years, controlled by liberal Democrats, and the condition of the poor in those places has consistently grown worse and not better?
There's so much to be said. Number one, quite often those Democrats are not liberal Democrats, but machine Democrats. Number two, the problem that I indicated before was that the middle class is leaving the big cities of the United States, taking their taxes, leaving the poor behind. This is a situation in almost every big city. And even the best-willed mayor in the world cannot solve that problem on his own resources. This is why the mayors have to look to Washington from the big cities, because they can't do it on their own. And by the way, one last point here, the conservative middle class, or the middle class, is now trying to continue this by putting a veto in the rent subsidy program that's now up before Congress, essentially to keep poor people out of the suburbs, to keep them locked back there in the city so that the problem will just feed upon itself.
Mr. Buckley, I detect a desire to answer.
Well, one last point is that was all nonsense, or most of it. New York City, in its own taxes, put up $800 million more in 1965 than it had at the beginning of at the beginning of the last term of Mr. Wagner. I'm not talking about federal money now. I'm talking about city money. And so it goes, I think, in Chicago and also in Los Angeles and also in Boston. I remember making a study of it at the time of a brief experience with municipal elections. But it is true that the resources are in the city. What Mr. Harrington isn't really touching is, are the resources within the city to do absolutely anything at all? And the answer is no, they aren't. Because if the moment comes when people have to subsidize everybody except for themselves, they're going to seek refuge somewhere else. The question, the most interesting question, which Mr. Harrington unfortunately doesn't analyze, is where are they going to find this kind of shelter? After we're through giving everything to the federal government and having the federal government control the entire continental limits of the United States, where do you go to express your protest? This is one of the reasons why people are afraid of centralized programs of this sort. Were you mugging just then?
I wasn't on camera. I wish I would.
I didn't note whether or not, Mr. Harrington, you had some secondary comment to what Mr. Buckley
Well,
just
one
said.
brief secondary comment that I sympathize profoundly with those who sit on their estates in Connecticut and tell us how the federal government is taking everything away and giving it to the poor. And I'd simply say it's obvious to everybody who looks that not only are there poor people in the United States, but the rich are getting richer. The luxury items are not doing badly.
Do I understand that the 800,000 people who left New York in the last 6 years found themselves country estates in Connecticut?
No, I was talking about one.
Yes, I know.
Gentlemen, I hadn't anticipated that we would have a debate on a single question on this program.
If you will study my record, I left Connecticut to come into New York. I'm one of the few who reversed that.
I remember. To
I
try
have
to
a
become
very
mayor.
neglected Connecticut estate at this moment.
Mr. Buckley, I believe the next question is directed to you from Howard Klein.
I'm Howard Klein, physician.
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering about your neglect of the emotional and spiritual lethargy of the poor, which are such important motivating factors, for example, in seeking work and other important sociological implications.
Well, I sought not to neglect it. I sought precisely not to neglect it by saying, I think on 3 or 4 different occasions, that we may really find that this is the root cause of human misery. I even quoted Paul Jacobs by saying that people in America are primarily psychologically pauperized rather than materially pauperized. And I have maintained consistently that the federal government is uniquely not the instrument by which you try to inspire people to shake themselves out of that particular lethargy, and that under the circumstances to put all of our eggs in this poverty basket is extremely dangerous, precisely because the thing to keep one's eyes on is exactly the point you raised.
Mr. Harrington, you have a choice. You can either rebut or you can wait for a next question, which is directed to all of you, which must be done in 1 minute.
Bill? I would just rebut by saying that there is a profound psychological problem among the poor. That's one of the terrible things about being poor, but not having enough to eat, living in a miserable tenement in Harlem or in Watts, not having a job, working all year and not being paid enough to support your family. These things, although they cause psychic misery, are not psychological, and these are the proper objects of federal and governmental policy. And I think if we get at them, then after people have something to eat, they can start to think about being happy.
Gentlemen, we have concluded this question and answer period. We'll be back in a moment.
Mr. Harrington, thank you very much for coming. You sometimes have a habit of suggesting that people who disagree with you are, quotes, waspish and callous, to use a phrase of yours. I appreciate your not having done that to me. And I do think that you make as eloquent a case for the poverty program as any I've ever heard. Thank you.